I was reading by the fire that night. Halfway through, a river runs through it, listening to the April rain drum on the roof. The doorbell rang, the old brass one I'd rewired myself last spring. I opened the door. She was standing there, soaked under the yellow porch light, hands folded in front of her like a child who'd lost her way. 8 years. I'd stopped hoping for her somewhere around year 4. She looked up at me with a trembling smile and said, "Silas, I'm sorry I'm 8 years late." That morning I'd wound the music box for the 96th time. Later I understood she hadn't come for her aunt's house. She'd come for me. My name is Silas Merrow. I'm 39 years old. I was born in Chestnut Grove, Virginia, a quiet suburb about 40 minutes outside Richmond, the kind of place where every street knows the name of every family's dog. I tune pianos for a living. My shop sits on 6th Street, a narrow storefront called Merrow & Company, and the carved wooden sign above the door was made by my grandfather in 1962. I restore old instruments, 2 music boxes, string instruments, and the pipe organ at the Baptist church every spring. I live alone in the 2-story craftsman house my parents left me. Gray slate roof, a front porch with a swing my father built the summer I turned 12, a wooden door with a brass handle worn smooth by 3 generations of Merrow hands. I wake at 5:30. I brew coffee in a green enamel pot. I eat breakfast with bread that Otis Redland, the 70-year-old carpenter from the workshop next to mine, bakes for me every Monday. I work until 6. At 6:10 I walk home, past Marlowe's Bakery, past Miss Enid's used bookshop, past the Red Maple at the corner of Linden Street. I haven't dated anyone since the divorce. I married Renata Halcott in 2016. We didn't have children together. We tried 2 cycles of IVF. Neither one took. Renata blamed me. She left in 2022. I wasn't angry. I was just tired. She remarried the next year. A man named Bram Ashford, a real estate developer working the Tidewater region, 10 times richer than me and 100 times louder. I wished her well and stopped thinking about her. The day Nell Halverson left Chestnut Grove the last week of October 2018, I was still wearing my wedding ring. She had walked into my shop on a September afternoon. 26 years old, quiet, carrying a walnut music box that had belonged to her grandmother. The main cylinder was broken. Claire de Lune stumbled in the middle, and the last third didn't play at all. She set the box on my counter the way you set down a sleeping child. I promised her 2 weeks. I took 6. I took 6 on purpose. She came 3 times to check on the progress. Each time we talked longer than the time before. About Debussy. About the children's books she was illustrating. About the way her grandmother had rocked her to sleep with that very music box in a farmhouse in Vermont 40 years ago. Both of us knew something dangerous was growing between us. I had a ring on my hand. I said nothing. She said nothing. The line held. Then she was gone. At the end of October I sent word. The music box is finished. Come by whenever you can. No answer. I asked her friend at Miss Enid's bookshop. They told me Nell had taken an illustration contract in Portland, Oregon, and left within the week. No address. Her phone number had changed. I put the music box on the top shelf of my workshop, by the window that faces the maple. Once a month I wound it. At first I told myself I'd return it the day I saw her again. By the 3rd year, I stopped telling myself anything. By the 5th year, I'd stopped remembering what month it was when I wound it. Otis said the same thing to me once a year, always at the end of a workday, always after a beer. "Silas, you're keeping that box because you never let a girl go." And every year I gave him the same answer. "Otis, I'm keeping it because I promised to fix it." He'd snort and let it drop. He never believed me. Some years I didn't believe me either. The workshop smelled like cedar and old varnish. Otis's saw hummed through the shared wall. Late afternoon sun slanted through a dusty window and lit the music box on its shelf, always at the same angle, always at the same time, like the sun itself was in on the promise. I had closed a chapter of my life. I didn't know Chestnut Grove was about to open it back up. A rainy April night. A doorbell. That was all it took. I brought her inside. I gave her a towel and one of my old flannel jackets and led her to the fire. She sat with her hands wrapped around the sleeves, shaking a little. She apologized twice for the water on the floor. I told her not to. I brewed black tea the way she used to take it 8 years ago, 3 slices of ginger, no sugar. She took the mug and looked up at me, and her eyes filled. You remembered, I said. There are things I don't forget. She told me about Aunt Mabel then. Mabel had passed in February quick, not the long, slow thing they'd all been bracing for. Nell was the sole beneficiary of the little house on Linden Street, 2 blocks over. She had come to sort through papers and decide whether to sell or keep. She'd be in town a few months. That was what she said. I nodded. I didn't ask her why she'd walked 2 blocks in a downpour instead of waiting for morning. Some questions you don't ask on the first night. Some questions you don't ask because you already suspect the answer, and you want to hear it from her mouth, in her own time. She stayed for an hour. When she stood to go, I offered a ride. She said she wanted to walk. At the door she paused. Silas, is it all right if I come by the shop tomorrow? I said yes. She smiled and stepped back out into the rain. The next morning I opened the shop earlier than usual. I didn't take the music box down. I wasn't ready. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Otis came in around 8, glanced at me, glanced at the coffee I hadn't touched, and went back to his workshop without a word. She came on the third day, 10 in the morning. The bell above the door rang, and she was standing in the doorway the way you stand at the start of a long flight, not moving forward, not moving back, waiting for someone else to make the first sound. She said, Silas, I came back for something I left here. I don't know if you still have it. I already knew what she meant. I had known before she'd finished the sentence. I walked to the back of the shop, climbed the little step stool, and lifted the walnut box down from the top shelf. Dust drifted off the lid in the light. I carried it out and set it on the counter between us. Her face fell in a way I hadn't seen a face fall in a very long time, not surprise, but recognition. Her hand trembled as she reached out. She touched the lid the way you touch a face you haven't seen in a long time. How long have you kept it? She asked. 8 years and 3 months, I said. According to the winding schedule. She looked at me for a long moment. I could see her wanting to say something else. She only said, thank you. At the time, I didn't understand why she didn't pick up the box and leave. She stayed another 10 minutes, asking me about the maple outside, about Marlowe's, about whether Miss Enid still ran the bookshop. Later, I understood she had waited 8 years to look at me from 40 inches away, and she wasn't ready for that moment to end. She started coming to the shop every day that first week, not for long 15-20 minutes. Tuesday, she brought me a scone from Marlowe's. Wednesday, she brought coffee. Thursday, she brought an old Randolph Caldecott picture book and set it on the counter without a word. We didn't talk much. We talked about the easy things, the maple, Aunt Mabel, the correct pin heights for a 1954 Steinway upright. She asked if she could sit and paint in the shop on Saturday afternoons. I said yes. The first Saturday, she came with her watercolor kit and a roll of paper. She settled in the corner by the window, near the tilted piano, waiting on Otis to finish its new legs. She painted for 3 hours without speaking. I work-tuned an old Baldwin console, checked the felts on a 1960 upright I was rebuilding for the middle school. There was something about that silence. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't awkward, it was just there. I realized I hadn't had anyone sit quietly with me for 4 years. Renata had never been quiet. Otis came through the back door around 5. He saw her, nodded once, and didn't say a word. He set his piano legs down with the kind of careful sound he makes when he doesn't want to interrupt a room. After she left, he tipped his cap back. Silas, he said, she looks at you like she's been carrying a picture of you in her wallet for a long time. I laughed it off. He didn't laugh. He just picked up his coffee and went back to his own bench. She left something under the counter that first Saturday, a rolled sheet of paper tied with a small note. Sorry for taking up space. N. I opened it after she was gone. It was a watercolor of my shop, the front window, the afternoon light of an April day, and a small figure inside me bent over a piano. The strange part was this. She'd never sat across the street to paint me. She'd only been in town 3 weeks. That painting couldn't have been made in 3 weeks. If I'd been more careful, I would have asked her about it that day. I didn't ask. I rolled the painting back up, put it in the drawer under my counter, and that night at home I took it out 3 times to look at it. I sat by the fire late that Saturday. I opened the drawer of the desk in the living room and pulled out 2 things, the new watercolor and an old photograph I'd taken in 2018, the walnut music box on the counter of my shop, the day she'd brought it in, the lid still closed. I laid them side by side. I didn't understand what I was comparing. The following weekend, she asked me to come over to Aunt Mabel's and help her move a piano. Mabel had an old upright in the basement that she wanted brought up to the parlor. I brought Otis. We lifted the piano, one careful step at a time, up the narrow stairs, my back against the low riser, and Otis calling out the count. Nell walked behind us with a hand on the bass end for balance. Halfway through the move, on the landing, a stack of letters slid out from a compartment beneath the piano bench and scattered onto the runner. Letters in Mabel's handwriting, tied with a piece of green ribbon, addressed to someone in the same looping script. Nell scooped them up quickly, her face gone red, and put them away in a sideboard drawer. I pretended not to see. Otis, standing above her, pretended not to see either. We got the piano into the parlor, tuned it briefly, drank the coffee she'd made, and left. Later I would learn that Aunt Mabel had written 11 letters to me over the last 3 years of her life. Every one of them was a partial letter, and every one was about her niece in Portland. Not a single letter was ever mailed. And Nell had read all of them. Something was building between us, slow, careful, like the way I repair an old instrument. But there was a shadow at the edge of it. She had a secret. I knew that much. I chose not to press, and she knew that I knew. She chose not to tell. The house on Linden Street smelled like old paper and lemon polish. The maple outside my shop rustled every Saturday around 4. Marlowe's coffee tasted the same as it had 8 years ago. My grandfather clock struck 11 every night I sat in the living room, with the watercolor on my knees, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. We were building something quietly, the way I rebuild a piano, one pin at a time, one string at a time. But I'd forgotten something. Every piano has one string that carries the most tension. Every story has one door that isn't locked. Ours was about to swing open, and the name on the door was Halcott. By the middle of May, I'd stopped noticing that I was smiling more. That was my first mistake. My second was going to Marlowe's on a Thursday afternoon to pick up 2 scones and a second cup of tea to bring back for Nell. It was almost 3. The bakery was slow. The scones came in a small brown paper bag with the top folded down. Renata walked in behind me just as I was paying. She had been visiting her sister 2 streets over and was on her way home. She saw the 2 scones. She saw the second cup with a little cardboard sleeve. She smiled, that particular sweet smile I'd learned to read across 10 years of marriage, the one that starts at the mouth and never quite reaches the eyes. She asked casually who I was bringing lunch to. I gave a short answer, a friend from out of town, and paid, and left. She let it go, but I could see her filing it away as I walked out, the way she filed away everything for later use. I had lived with Renata for 10 years. I knew that look. That was the look of someone calculating the next move. That look had shown up at every dinner party where someone had said something she didn't like, and it had always meant she was about to make a call. She called me that afternoon. Not that evening, that afternoon. Within an hour. "Silas, I'm happy for you. I heard you're seeing a Portland girl?" I asked her who told her. She laughed. "Chestnut Grove is only 3 blocks wide. You remember?" I said something noncommittal and hung up. My hands were already colder than they'd been an hour before. 3 days later, she showed up at my shop. She timed it. She came at 4 in the afternoon on a Friday, the exact hour she knew Nell would be dropping by. She carried a bottle of wine. She said she was just passing through and wanted to say hello. Then Nell walked in. The 2 women stood facing each other across my counter for the first time. Renata introduced herself with a smile so polite it made the back of my neck cold. "Hi, I'm Renata, Silas's ex-wife. I've heard so much about you." Nell didn't flinch. She stood straight. Something in the room went thin. The air felt like it had been drawn back from a window. Renata set the wine bottle down on the counter and, with a small, careless motion, knocked into a teacup beside it. The cup fell and shattered on the floor. I moved without thinking. I reached up and pulled a cloth over the walnut music box on the shelf behind me. It was an unconscious motion, the reflex of a man who had been protecting something for 8 years. Renata saw. Renata remembered the box. Renata smiled. She turned to me, but she was watching Nell. "Silas," she said, "did you ever wonder why she came back exactly when your life was settling down?" I opened my mouth. She didn't wait. "Because in 2023 she wrote to me, Do you want to guess what she asked? Nel went pale. She asked me whether you still tuned the Steinway at the Baptist Church on 6th Street on Tuesdays. That was it. One sentence. 3 years ago. While the ink on our divorce papers was still drying, I froze, not because of Renata. Because I looked at Nell, and Nell didn't deny it. She didn't say a word. She only looked at me, and her eyes said, "I'm sorry." They didn't say she's lying. Renata picked up her wine bottle, set it back down, and gave Nell one more polite smile. "I just thought you should know how long she's been keeping an eye on you. A good man like Silas deserves to make his decisions with all the information." Then she left. The bell over the door rang. The sound hadn't fully faded when Nell was at the door too. "Silas," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. "I need some time to put this into sentences. Please don't come find me right away." She left. I stood there. The shards of the teacup were still on the floor. The music box was still covered by the cloth. I didn't go looking for her. She didn't come back. I worked. I ate. I slept. I moved through the shop like a man doing the dishes after a funeral hand's correct. Head somewhere else. Otis watched me and didn't ask. On the second day he came into the shop, poured himself a cup of my coffee, and stood a long moment beside the walnut box on the shelf. He said only this, "Silas, the truth is like a piano. How someone plays it matters more than what note is being played." I didn't answer. He drank his coffee and left. I don't think Otis knew exactly what had happened, but he'd been on the earth long enough to read a room. That second night I sat by the fire again. I pulled the drawer open and took the watercolor of the shop back out. I set it on my knees. I thought about what Renata had said, how long she's been keeping an eye on you. And I thought about the way she had said it, and I thought about how many small pieces of my life she had used as ammunition over 10 years of marriage. And then I thought, if it's true that Nell has been watching from a distance, what exactly is wrong with that? She had loved me 8 years ago. She had left because I wore a ring, and she had left cleanly, without a scene, without a hint, without asking me to make a choice I couldn't have made. She had asked one single question in 3 years. She had waited. Renata wasn't lying. She had chosen the piece of the truth that would hurt me the most, and set it down between us like a bottle of wine on a counter. But that piece, if I stopped listening to her voice, and just looked at the fact itself, if I set it under a plain light, was the most beautiful piece of Nell. Everything Renata had used as a weapon was, on its own, evidence of something else. Evidence of patience, evidence of a woman who had loved me from a distance for the better part of a decade and had never once made me responsible for it. On the third day, Renata called me again. She suggested dinner, like two old friends. I said no. She said, "Silas, I'm just trying to protect you. You always did trust people too much." I said, "Renata, you left me because you wanted more. You don't get to come back and rearrange my life." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not because I was angry. They were shaking because I had just realized I'd wasted 3 days. I sat by the fire that night. The rain had picked up again, outside, light rain, the kind that taps on the windows more than the roof. I could still smell the sour edge of wine on the shop counter. I hadn't scrubbed it hard enough. The teacup shards were on a rag by the sink. The grandfather clock struck 11, and I knew what I had to do the next morning. There was a line my grandfather used to say, "When an instrument stays silent too long, one of two things is true. Either it's broken, or it's waiting for the right hands." I pulled on my raincoat. I walked the 2 blocks, and I knocked on the door of Aunt Mabel's house. It was Saturday morning, a light rain. She opened the door with red eyes, but her expression was calm. She stepped back to let me in. On the low table in the parlor, a brown leather portfolio was already laid out. She said, "I was going to bring this to your shop this afternoon. You came earlier than I thought." She opened it. Inside were 8 watercolors, each dated in the lower right corner in her small, careful hand. 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026. Each one was a scene from Chestnut Grove, painted from memory, my shop front, with the sign my grandfather had carved, the red maple in 3 different seasons, the porch of the Baptist church where I tuned every Tuesday, Marlowe's bakery with its striped awning, the white fence on Linden Street, and in 6 of the 8, A soft, blurred figure. Always me. Always bent over an instrument, or locking the shop door at dusk, or holding a cup of coffee at the corner of 6th and Linden waiting for the light to change. I sat down slowly. I turned each page. She had painted my life from 2,000 miles away and set it into 8 small rectangles of paper. She said quietly, "I didn't come back here to paint these. I painted one every year, from Portland. I painted what I remembered. I wouldn't let myself forget." She sat down across from me. She told me the whole thing calmly, without ornament, as if she'd been rehearsing it for years and had, over time, whittled it down to only the sentences that would still be true when she spoke them. She had walked into my shop in 2018 only to have the music box repaired. She hadn't come with any plan. But by the 3rd visit, she'd realized she was inventing reasons to come back. She'd noticed the ring on my hand. She understood what it meant. She wasn't going to be the woman who blew up a marriage from the outside. She'd accepted the illustration contract in Portland and left within a week. She left the music box on purpose. She told herself, "If I ever hear he's no longer wearing that ring, I'll come back for it." In 2023, Aunt Mabel had mailed her a church newsletter. In the prayer requests, one line, "Please keep Silas Marrow in your prayers after his separation." She hadn't dared believe it. She was afraid of false hope. She'd written to Renata, not to gloat, not to poke around. She only needed to know one thing. Was I still there? If the Steinway at the Baptist church was still being tuned every Tuesday, then I was still in Chestnut Grove, still working, still all right. That was all she needed. Renata had answered in one sentence. "Don't bother him. He isn't the man you used to like." Nell had backed away for 3 more years. Then Aunt Mabel had died. Nell had received the letter from the estate lawyer. She'd known this was her last chance. She'd come home. "Silas," she said, "I didn't come to Chestnut Grove for the house. I came because the house gave me a reason to come. But I'm asking you, please don't think I was scheming. I gave you 8 years of my absence. I'm asking you for 3 months of my presence. And you can choose." I sat down in the chair across from her. I looked at the 8 watercolors. I looked at her. I thought about the music box on my shelf for 8 years, 96 windings. I thought she had loved me from 2,000 miles away for 8 years, and she called that scheming. I had kept her music box for 8 years, and I called that a repair I hadn't finished. We had used different words for the same thing. I stood up. I opened the pocket of my raincoat. I took out the music box. I had brought it with me. I set it down on the table, right in the middle of the 8 watercolors. I opened the lid. I wound the key. Claire de Lune began to play. Slow, stumbling a little at the 4th note, a small hitch I had never quite fixed, because somewhere along the way I had made a private decision to leave that flaw in as a place to remember her. It was a piano tuner's superstition. Some notes you don't correct. Some notes tell you where the story lived, Nell cried. Silently. She didn't wipe the tears away. She listened to that stumble, and something in her shoulders let go, as if it had been held there for 8 years and had only just been given permission to fall. "Nell," I said, "I don't need 3 months. I've had 8 years of not knowing. I don't want to spend another day of it." She took my hand. Her hand was cold. Mine was warm from the teacup she'd already poured before I'd arrived. She had been waiting for me, and I hadn't known. She had set out 2 cups. She had been ready for me to come, and she had been ready for me not to. We didn't kiss. Not yet. It felt too fast for a moment that had taken 8 years to arrive. We sat there in the sound of a slightly broken lullaby, holding hands, until the winding ran out and the room went back to the ticking of Aunt Mabel's mantel clock. The rain kept its light rhythm on the porch. The gray light of a June morning filtered through Aunt Mabel's lace curtains. The room smelled of watercolor paper and pigment. Claire de Lune stumbled on the 4th note, and neither of us moved to correct it. We began slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild a cylinder that has been silent for 8 years. By July, I was eating Sunday dinner at Aunt Mabel's house every week. Nell cooked. She wasn't great. She oversalted the chicken, and she never got the potatoes quite right. But the food was warm, and the table was set with her grandmother's plates, and I found I didn't miss anything about eating alone. I brought Otis's bread. Sometimes I brought a bottle of the local cider from the orchard out past the reservoir. We ate slow. We talked about everything except the 8 years, not because we were avoiding them, but because we didn't need them. We were building something new, something with its own weight and its own sound, that didn't need to keep looking backward to know where it was. In August, she opened a small studio in the back room of Mabel's house, the room with the window looking out onto the maple garden. She took on illustration work by video from her laptop, 2 publishers in New York, 1 in San Francisco, a small independent house in Minneapolis. She stayed in Chestnut Grove. She didn't fly back to Portland to pack. She asked a friend to ship a few boxes and let the lease on her apartment go. That was how I knew she wasn't planning to leave. That was how she told me without saying it out loud. Otis invited her over to the workshop one afternoon and handed her a small piece of walnut. He didn't explain. He just put it in her hand and told her to feel the grain. "You could learn to work a cylinder," he told her afterward. "Pianos are like people. They remember whose hands touched them." She laughed, the low, warm laugh I'd heard maybe 6 times in 8 years, and never long enough. I understood what Otis had just done. He had accepted her into his kind of family, in the only language he spoke. In October, on a Saturday afternoon in my workshop, she pulled the walnut music box down from where I now kept it on the shelf above my bench. She asked, "The second cylinder in the music box, the one my grandmother wanted fixed, but never got to, what does it play?" I said, "Brahms's Lullaby." "But that cylinder is worse than the first one." I never had the nerve to try. I was afraid I'd ruin it. She said, "Show me how to fix it. I'll do it myself." 3 weeks. Every Saturday afternoon, she held the tweezers. I guided her. I explained the geometry of a pinned brass cylinder, the way my grandfather had explained it to me: a comb, a set of teeth, a small revolution of pins that pluck a lullaby out of the air. She broke the pin sequence twice, the first time out of nerves, the second time out of confidence. The third time she got it right, and the second cylinder turned. Brahms's Lullaby rose out of the walnut box, thin, slow, and cleaner than my own repair on Clair de Lune. She looked up at me, smiling, with wet eyes. I said, "You just fixed something I couldn't fix in 8 years." She answered, and I wrote this line inside my head like an engraver writes into wood. "Some things can only be fixed when the right person is in the room." 2 cylinders. 1 flawed Clair de Lune, 1 perfect Brahms's Lullaby, both inside a single walnut box, a grandmother's music box, an aunt's letters, a piano tuner's shelf, an illustrator's Portland years, all of it folded down into one small resonating chamber, all of it finally playing the way it had been meant to. In September, I'd heard through Renata's sister that Renata and Bram had separated. She had moved back to Richmond. I didn't feel much of anything. I hoped she'd be all right, but she wasn't my story anymore. The first snow of the year came on a December Tuesday. I proposed on my front porch that evening, not on one knee, just sitting beside her on the porch swing, holding out a silver ring I had made in Otis's workshop over 3 weekends. Simple band, 2 small notes engraved on the inside, the 4th note of Clair de Lune and the last note of Brahms's Lullaby. She took the ring. She didn't say anything for a full minute, then she said, "Silas, I've been waiting 9 years and 3 months. I don't need to think about this. We were married in April, in the garden behind Aunt Mabel's house. 1 year to the week from the night she'd stood on my porch in the rain. The red maple was in early bud. Otis walked her down the aisle. She'd asked him, and he'd cried when she asked. I set the music box on a small table between the 2 chairs, wound it before the vows, and let Clair de Lune play through the whole ceremony. The 4th note stumbled the same way it had for 8 years, and no one tried to fix it. 2 of her friends flew in from Portland. My cousins came up from Norfolk. Miss Enid closed the bookshop for the afternoon. My vow. I kept a box for 8 years without knowing I was keeping it. I waited for you without knowing I was waiting. Now I know, and I don't intend to stop knowing. Her vow. I loved you from 2,000 miles away. Now, I'm asking to love you from the length of a breakfast table. For the rest of my life. We didn't take a honeymoon. Neither of us wanted one. We stayed home. Otis brought beer and a small cedar cutting board he'd made in the shop the week before. Nell painted a new watercolor that first Sunday of married life, the 9th one of my shop front, but with a new sign above the door. Marrow and Halverson Instruments and Illustration. I framed it. I hung it inside the shop, over the counter where she'd first set the music box down 8 years and 7 months before. The garden that April afternoon smelled like new maple leaves and lilacs from Mrs. Aldrich's fence line. Claire de Lune stumbled on its fourth note in the afternoon sun. Her silver ring clicked once against a wineglass when she raised it. Otis was laughing behind me, his big carpenter's laugh that carries across a yard, and I could smell the bread he'd baked for the reception, still warm on the table under the pear tree. 2 months later, on a June morning, I sat in my workshop and looked at the walnut music box on the mantel, over the fireplace of our living room. It was our living room now, and I began to understand why I had wound it 96 times. 3 weeks ago, I wound the music box for the 102nd time. Nell was standing in the workshop doorway, holding a cup of the coffee I'd brewed her. She watched me wind it, and she didn't say a word. I understood she was counting with me. I've lived 39 years, and I believe this. Some meetings look like beginnings, and some meetings look like the end of a long waiting. That rainy night, when I opened the door and saw her under the yellow porch light, I thought I was witnessing a beginning. Now I know it was the moment 8 years of silence finally found a voice. The walnut music box sits on the mantel over our fireplace. 2 cylinders inside it. One is mine, Claire de Lune, still stumbling on the 4th note. One is hers, Brahms' Lullaby, perfect. We haven't repaired the stumble. We've come to understand something. Some flaws are the way memory sounds when it plays. I used to think love was finding the right person. Now I know love is staying in the right place, long enough for the right person to find you. So let me ask you 2 things. Are you keeping a music box of your own, something you've held on to without knowing why? And if the person you once let slip away were standing on your doorstep tonight, would you open the door? If Silas and Nell's story reached something in you, leave them a heart in the comments. Hit like if you believe in the slow returns. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, a new ending worth waiting for, every week. And tell me down there, have you ever waited 9 years for someone?